The film begins by showing a young girl named Sylvie who recently lost her boyfriend to pancreatic cancer. That night she planned to go to Russia with her boyfriend's ashes, but she overslept at the time of departure and arrived late at the airport. Even so, Sylvie got help from the airport staff, who gave her a new plane ticket with no extra cost. She smiled and said thank you. The airport officer felt sorry for her after Sylvie showed her the ashes of her boyfriend's body. Sylvie said she wanted to go to Russia because she and her boyfriend previously wanted to go on vacation to Russia. Unfortunately, her boyfriend died instead, so she might remember him by fulfilling their unfulfilled wish. On the other hand, a flight attendant named Gabri admonished her new colleague not to take aspirin because it is not good for the baby in the womb. However, Chloe denied that she was not pregnant. Still, Gabri knew because she already had 3 children and had experience with many of the general symptoms that pregnant women experience. Even Gabri can guess who the baby's father in Chloe's stomach is: Matthew, the co-pilot of their plane. She apparently saw Matthew come out of Chloe's room in Finland. Actually, he already has a wife, and Chloe is his mistress. Chloe finally admits, and she says Matthew doesn't know about her pregnancy, so she intends to tell him after they arrive in Russia. Meanwhile, a man named Terenzio was very in a hurry. He went to the plane counter and said he wanted to give his friends belongings, who had boarded the plane. But the officers could not let him just like that, even though he claimed to be one of the soldiers from NATO. Because of that, Terenzio bought his own ticket. Regardless of his important destination, he could go west as soon as possible. For some reason, his demeanor seemed so hasty, even when waiting for his plane to depart. Not long after, Terenzio panicked after seeing the news on television. Without thinking, he attacked a security officer and took his firearm. He shouted for everyone to get out of the way while carrying the gun, thus making everyone panic and fear. Gabri, who heard a commotion outside, immediately checked it out. After seeing this situation, she tried to block Terenzio from entering by closing the plane door, but she failed. When the plane was only filled with some passengers, Terenzio entered the cockpit. He immediately pointed his gun at Matthew and urged him to fly the plane immediately. He explained that the morning sun would kill them all if they didn't leave now. However, this sounded so ridiculous and unbelievable to Matthew that he didn't comply and instead asked him to calm down. Suddenly, the voice of one of the passengers ordered someone to immediately contact the police. It caught Terenzio off guard, so Matthew took the opportunity to seize his weapon. Unfortunately, his attempt failed, and Matthew seemed to wince in pain because his hand was shot. Terenzio again urged him, but Matthew said he could not fly the plane alone because his left hand was also injured. Shortly after, Terenzio went to the passenger seat and asked if anyone could fly the plane, otherwise, everyone would die. Then Sylvie raised her hand. She had never flown a plane, but she had flown a helicopter. Afterward, she followed Terenzio, who led him into the cockpit. The plane slowly started to move. Gabri, who knew the plane had been hijacked, remained professional, tried to calm all passengers, and told them to fasten their seatbelts. Soon after, Matthew tried to persuade Terenzio to give up his intention, but he persisted and even threatened to kill Sylvie, and Matthew was forced to comply. A few moments after the plane took off, Matthew confessed that what Terenzio said made no sense. He asks how the sun can kill, but Terenzio insisted on telling the truth. He wasn't crazy even though he was an officer in NATO. Terenzio said this information was not made public, but he had heard that the cause of everyone's death began when the sun rose. Even before their plane flew, the incident had already occurred in Asia and America. He said the sun's rays would seriously kill all living things in its path. Therefore, he intended to go to the west to an area where there was still night so they could escape the day. The point is Terenzio wanted to escape from the sun. After hearing Terenzio's explanation, Sylvie glanced at Matthew, who looked unwell due to the wound on his hand. Sylvie said she wanted Matthew to be treated immediately. At first, Terenzio refuses, but in the end, he allows it after Sylvie insists that they wouldn't be able to go anywhere if Matthew got into trouble. Sylvie then exits the cockpit and meets Gabri and a man named Jakub, an aircraft technician. Jakub intends to pour Terenzio solid hot coffee to fight back. Sylvie thought it might be a good idea, but now something more important was Matthew, who needed a doctor. After that, she asked the passengers if there was a doctor among them. Then Laura raised her hand. However, she wasn't a doctor and was just a nurse. In the cockpit, Terenzio reassured Matthew of the truth of what he said. He even told Matthew to contact anyone down there. But Matthew replied that the plane's radio had been damaged because the bullets seemed to have hit the avionics. Matthew said he couldn't fix it unless they landed because the avionics could only be reached outside the plane. Because of that, Terenzio looked slightly annoyed, but he put that aside and asked how much fuel they had and how far they could fly to the west with the remaining fuel. Then, Matthew replied that he had to calculate it first. Shortly after, Sylvie came with Laura and immediately checked Matthew's wound. He asked Terenzio not to say anything about the sun to the passengers. He didn't want to make all the passengers panic and said let him be the one to explain to the passengers. Terenzio agreed with his words, then Matthew made an announcement and apologized to the passengers. Suddenly, Sylvie suggested they land in Iceland, and Matthew agreed as they had enough fuel to get there. Soon after, Laura came and said Matthew's wound had to be stitched up, but the problem was they didn't have sewing thread or anything. Sylvie then suggested cauterization, a medical practice that burns the injured body part to reduce bleeding and minimize infection. Even though it sounded scary and painful, Matthew had no other choice and agreed. In the passenger cabin, one of the passengers, named Zara, started to protest. She had to go to Russia immediately to take her sick son for surgery. She wasn't even afraid and challenged Terenzio even though he threatened to shoot her. The other passengers who saw this tried to restrain Zara, but the commotion stopped after they all heard Matthew's screams from inside the cockpit. Fortunately, Laura had finished treating the wound on Matthew's hand and was now wrapping it with bandages. When finished, she returned to the passenger cabin and was about to return to her seat, but a man named Ayaz reprimanded her and asked about the issue about the sun that can kill. However, she said it seemed their pilot didn't believe about it. There, it could be concluded that Laura and Ayaz actually knew about it, but they also still have doubts. Soon after, the commotion occurred again when one of the youths had a severe cough. It was enough to distract Terenzio and was used quite well by Ayaz. Afterward, he managed to grab Terenzio's firearm and lock Terenzio in the toilet. Suddenly, Ayaz turned to point the gun at Matthew and demanded to tell the truth. Matthew said that he didn't believe about the issue, but he pretended to believe and obeyed Terenzio's wish so he wouldn't do anything bad. Matthew explained that their plane would land in Iceland to hand Terenzio over to the authorities. After hearing that, Ayaz warned him not to lie anymore. Long story short, the plane entered the territory of Iceland. When Matthew asked for permission to make a landing, he did not get an answer from the Icelandic airport. They were also very surprised when they saw a chaotic place with several planes on fire. Then he gave up his intention to land there and asked Sylvie to find another alternative place close enough because the plane's fuel was also running low. After seeing what happened, Sylvie and Matthew began to feel that Terenzio's words might be true. Matthew immediately went to the passenger room, then Matthew took Terenzio out of the toilet and asked him to tell him all the information he knew. But Terenzio refused to speak before his weapon was returned. Matthew was forced to give it even though he got protests from other passengers. Terenzio then explained that the sun could kill them, which has happened in several areas. He said that all they had to do was keep flying toward the west to avoid the sun. The problem was that their plane didn't have enough fuel now, though Matthew promised to take care of it and asked all passengers to sit quietly. Matthew and Sylvie returned to the cockpit. They were planning to go to the Scottish airport. Even though Scotland was 80 km to the east and they didn't have enough fuel to go there, they had no choice as there was no other airport close enough. Luckily, they still had enough time before morning, and Matthew would also try to fly the plane at a low speed so he could save fuel. He then asked Jakub to immediately look for fuel when they arrived there, but instead, Jakub wanted him to return to Belgium so he could save his wife. Of course, Matthew refused, so Jakub left the cockpit. He seemed to grumble and call Jakub unprofessional, but Sylvie understood Jakub's attitude because he was just a human who loved his wife. Meanwhile, in the passenger cabin, Ayaz walked over to Laura, who was trying to help a young man named Abdul, who looked unwell. She said there seemed to be a problem with his stomach, but she didn't know the cause because Abdul spoke Arabic. Soon after, a man named Osman, who can speak Arabic, tried to help by translating Abdul's words, but he only heard an incoherent mumble. Even so, he could hear Abdul say that he had swallowed the diamond, which shocked and confused them. Sometime later, when the plane arrived in Scottish territory, one of the engines suddenly died because the fuel was running out. As an experienced pilot, Matthew looked calm, then turned off all aircraft engines so that the plane flew in a balanced manner and only relied on the wind to make a landing at the airport. Matthew and Sylvie finally managed to land their plane safely, even though they almost hit a building. Matthew then warns the passengers to stay seated on the plane, but a woman named Inez breaks through and passes Gabri, who prevents him from getting out. She exited the plane slide and was soon followed by all the other passengers. There they were able to regain the signal to open the internet, but the bad news was that the solar catastrophe that killed all living things was true. Not long after, a car came, and 3 criminals were driving it. The criminals reported that the world had ended. They didn't have much time, and they had to leave quickly. Everyone looked confused and wondered where they were going. Then Sylvie over there answered, "Into the night." The scene then changes, showing Jakub's memories with his wife, Lena, who is pregnant. They both look so affectionate and love each other, but he never thought that something terrible like now would happen, thus making him have to lose his beloved wife. The scene returns, showing Jakub trying to contact his wife. Not only Jakub but others were also seen doing the same thing, trying to contact their family members, although none of them seemed to have succeeded. On the other hand, Laura has not given up on giving help to Abdul, hoping that he can breathe again, but unfortunately, his life cannot be saved. So that made Laura, Ayaz, and Osman look confused about whether his body will be buried immediately or not. Meanwhile, the 3 criminals they had just met claimed to be abandoned by their group while combing the city. The 3 criminals asked to join will also provide assistance because they have expertise. The 3 criminals were named Roger, Freddie, and John. Soon after, Matthew happily greeted them, then Roger suggested they leave immediately because they had no other choice. After all, even the people hiding in the bunkers still died from this sun. Despite receiving this information, Jakub insisted that they return to Belgium to save his wife, Lena, but because he was alone, he lost the vote. Matthew then said the safety of the passengers is his responsibility. He does not want to risk returning to Belgium, thus making Jakub very disappointed and upset. Not wanting to waste time, everyone immediately scattered to collect the various supplies. Meanwhile, Inez and Rick searched for supplies by searching other passengers' bags. There, she secretly hid a bottle of liquor in her bag. There she asked why Abel's body was not buried immediately, and Rick replied that the method of burying it was not the same as theirs because of different beliefs. On the other hand, Gabri and the others seemed to come to Sylvie because there was a slight problem. Zara refused to come along. They then came and tried to persuade her. There was no other intention. They just cared and could not bear to leave the mother and son. Zara is adamant that she doesn't want to come. She doesn't believe the story about the son. She also couldn't let her son stay on the plane any longer because he said that would worsen his son's condition. Her son is named Dominic. Suddenly, Sylvie got a slap from Zara for forcing her. After failing to properly persuade Laura and Sylvie, they were forced to inject drugs into Zara and take her, who was unconscious, onto the plane. Roger, an Air Force pilot, now takes Sylvie's place to help Matthew in the cockpit. Sylvie was quite happy because she could sit back in her seat in the passenger cabin. After exiting the cockpit, she met Ayaz and Freddie, who were trying to open the avionics room. They tried to fix the radio, and Jakub should have handled this problem, but he refused because he was still angry. After hearing this, Sylvie went straight to Jakub, who looked still in a bad mood. She said their destination was now Canada, although she didn't know where exactly. She told a little about her personal problems, namely about the death of her lover, Henry. She said that losing a loved one was the hardest thing. Even at first, she intended to kill herself after traveling to Russia. But now that she had changed her mind, it was better for her to do something to help the people still alive. She also hoped that Jakub could do the same. It seems her words just now managed to help him. On the other hand, Laura was a little annoyed when she found out that Inez had searched and taken food in the form of chocolate from her bag, but Inez reasoned that she did that because Matthew had told her to. Terenzio, beside Inez, scolded and told Laura to return to her seat. However, Laura did not accept it until there was a heated argument between them. Fortunately, Inez tried to mediate and return the chocolate to her. Shortly after talking to Sylvie, Jakub seemed to help Ayaz and Freddie repair the broken radio. Not long after, there was a scream from one of the passengers, who cheered with joy because the internet could be back on. It seemed that a man named Horst had managed to fix the plane's internet server. After regaining internet access, Rick accidentally reads an article that this incident is related to the changing polarity of the sun. Hearing this, Horst concluded that the reverse polarity of the sun resulted in the lethal radiation of the sun's rays. He said there might be a time when this terrible phenomenon would stop, but he didn't know when. Horst is apparently a climate scientist. He said it was possible Oxford scientists had calculated when this terrible phenomenon would stop. But unfortunately, the article was published an hour ago, coinciding with the rising sun in England. That means the Oxford scientists and the person who wrote the article may be dead by now. After that, Ayaz invited Sylvie to talk elsewhere. He explained that initially, he intended to search for air bases on the internet. Suddenly, he found something unexpected. It turned out that the 3 criminals named Roger, Freddie, and John were war criminals and had committed serious crimes, including murder, robbery, and rape. The incident happened in Afghanistan, and Sylvie also remembered that she had seen the news when she was in Afghanistan. Ayaz thought the 3 of them were very dangerous and that they should no longer allow the 3 criminals to be around the other passengers. At the same time, John gets into an argument with Inez when he takes a bottle of liquor from her bag without permission. Even though she told him to return it, John didn't care and opened the bottle. He does seem to have a bad temper. Before that, he even teased and seduced Gabri. When the bottle cap was opened, the sound was loud enough to make an old man named Mr. Volkov think it was a gunshot. He panicked and intended to get out by trying to open the plane door. Seeing that, John panicked and quickly pulled Mr. Volkov until he fell and his head hit something. The incident shocked everyone. Then Laura appeared and tried to help him, but he died from heavy bleeding in his head. Laura, as Mr. Volkov's nurse, who had known him, was very sad and angry. She called John a murderer. Then John tried to defend himself. He reasoned he just wanted to save the passengers, so Mr. Volkov didn't open the plane door. Soon after, Horst interrupted and said that the plane door would not open if the plane was flying. His words made everyone blame John. Then John, who didn't accept it, took out his gun and pointed it at everyone. Not long after, Ayaz appeared with Freddie, immediately calming John down. After the atmosphere was conducive, Matthew said that in a few hours, they would land in Canada. He suggested that they all rest. After the incident earlier, it seemed Sylvie had come to her senses and reconsidered Ayaz's words. The 3 criminals were indeed dangerous. Even one of them had killed one of them by accident. Sylvie then went to the cockpit and told Matthew about it by pretending to change the bandage on his hand. Even though Roger was among them at the time, Sylvie spoke in French, so he didn't understand. She explained to Matthew that the 3 criminals were in Scotland to undergo a military tribunal for murder and rape. The people deliberately abandoned the 3 criminals because they were serving the death penalty. She wanted them off the plane and already had a plan with Ayaz and Jakub. There, Roger was a little suspicious and insinuated to Sylvie that she was talking about him. She explained that she spoke French because she didn't know medical terms in English. Sometime later, their plane landed in Canada. Matthew divided them into groups to split up and look for supplies. Initially, Sylvie and Matthew's plan was to send the 3 criminals to separate places under the pretext of looking for radio components, then leave them secretly. But Roger instead asked Jacob and Gabriel to come with them. According to Roger, Jakub will know what things are needed, considering he is a technician. However, Gabriel also joined as a translator because he could not speak English. Unfortunately, Matthew and Sylvie were forced to agree to that. They didn't want to arouse suspicion, plus the 3 criminals had a gun. They said they could only rely on Jakub for this plan. Soon after, the 5 people departed by using a car. On the way, Gabriel looked shocked to see human corpses strewn on the road just like that. There was even a school bus containing children who had died from the sun. Shortly after Jakub and Gabriel left, Matthew told everyone the truth about the 3 criminal armies. Matthew explained the plan to leave them, and the people seemed surprised to hear that. He warned them to keep doing their respective duties and taking supplies because Jakub was currently stalling, and they only had 30 minutes. Soon after, Ayaz interrupted and said he wanted to bury Abdul's body. Hearing that, Matthew allowed it, but he had to hurry because they didn't have much time. A few moments later, Ayaz washed Abdul's body, but he was not alone because Osman helped. But then he asked Osman to bring him another blanket because it seemed that one blanket was not enough to cover Abdul's body. Meanwhile, Jakub manages to buy time by showing Roger, Freddy, and John the wrong location. They intended to look for new radio components, but Jakub took them to places they shouldn't, such as salons and pizzerias. In the car, only Jakub had a cell phone and could open Google Maps, so he was the guide. But the 3 criminals were annoyed, so he was forced to give the actual location. Shortly after, they arrived at a place that looked like an electronics store. When he was inside, Jakub got his radio components without the 3 criminals knowing. Then he pretended not to have found it while asking the 3 criminals to search the warehouse. The 3 criminals entered the warehouse, and Jakub immediately locked the door. Gabri, who still doesn't know, looks confused, but Jakub can't explain now and immediately invites her. But she refused his invitation, and Jakub was forced to leave her. Jakub knew he didn't have much time before the 3 criminals could escape. It didn't take long. The 3 criminals could break into the door and immediately follow him. Seeing this, Roger, Freddy, and John immediately rushed to catch up with his car, while Gabri was left alone because they did not care about her. Meanwhile, Sylvie and the others on the plane were already preparing to take off, but they are still waiting for Jakub and Gabri to return. When he saw 2 cars coming from a distance, Sylvie told Ayaz to close the door if it wasn't Jakub and Gabri. Then she got ready in the cockpit with Matthew. Fortunately, Jakub managed to get there first and told Ayaz that Gabri didn't make it. Afterward, Ayaz closed the plane door. Seeing the plane moving forward, the 3 criminals panicked and started shooting at the plane until one of the bullets hit the plane's window pane. Seeing that, Rick shouted to stop. The scene then changes, showing the plane already flying in the air. It looks like Matthew is checking the window glass cracked by the 3 criminals' gunfire. He doubted whether the glass could hold up, considering they had already taken off. On the other hand, Jakub seemed guilty because he had left Gabri. Then Matthew reassured him that it was not his fault. Meanwhile, Ayaz and Dominic seemed quite familiar. Other people who saw them might mistake them and think the 2 were father and son. Soon after, Ayaz offered Dominic an orange, but he commented the orange tasted like lime. Afterward, Ayaz tried it and agreed with him. Not long after, Zara came and immediately scolded Ayaz not to get close to her son. However, he only meant to be friendly, but she misunderstood and thought he was spreading charm. He was confused by Zara's attitude. On the other hand, Matthew asked Rick to sit by the cracked window to watch it so they could anticipate if anything untoward happened. Rick, of course, refused for fear of being sucked out if the glass broke. However, Matthew assures that the window is safe, but Terenzio gets fed up and says that Matthew is not their leader who can decide. Shortly after, Terenzio began to blame others, to the point of making people feel annoyed with him. Horse stopped their bickering, saying they had a radio link from another plane. But Horse thought wrong. Apparently, someone from the other side said they were underwater, not on another plane. Their location is in Hawaii, more precisely, somewhere with underwater facilities that serve as a training ground for astronauts. The man said that it looked like the water could withstand the radiation from the sun or whatever caused this catastrophe, so they are still alive today. That person will gladly accept Matthew and his friends if they want to join there because their facility can accommodate 100 people. In the cockpit room, Matthew was talking with Sylvie. He seemed to have decided to accept the offer from people in Hawaii and would take their plane to Hawaii. However, she refused and said Hawaii was far away and should be heading south instead of west. She asked if she could arrive in Hawaii before sunrise. Matthew replied that he could fly the plane higher to get there faster. Even so, Sylvie was still quite hesitant, plus they didn't know what kind of person awaited them there. Hearing that, he looked annoyed and said they should take this opportunity because they could die if they continued to fly without a clear purpose. It wasn't long before Matthew came to his senses and immediately apologized. All the emotional stress and responsibility as an airplane pilot made him unable to think straight. Fortunately, Sylvie could understand it. Then she suggested that Matthew rest, but he refused. Suddenly there was a commotion from the passenger cabin. At first, Matthew intended to check it out, but Sylvie held back and said to let her go. She stepped back and asked what was going on. Laura then explained that Terenzio was holding back all their food supplies. However, he still defended himself. He said he wanted them to make and determine the rules on this plane. Rick, who is now cooperating with Terenzio, said they wanted all decisions to be made democratically and not to obey Matthew's orders. Terenzio said he wants all meals to be divided equally, and every time they decide on their next destination, he wants all passengers to vote. When the atmosphere was getting hotter, Matthew's voice from the cockpit suddenly called Sylvie because of an emergency. The plane sensor said there was a fire in the engine. He asked Sylvie to help him with the repair work, but the alarm went off. Soon another alarm went off again and stopped by itself too. He felt suspicious, and he remembered that the sensor was in the wheel space of the plane. Matthew guessed that someone had accidentally touched it. Suddenly, he remembered the 3 evil criminals they had left behind. He thought one of them managed to climb up the plane's wheels and hide in its wheelhouse. That's the only plausible reason to explain how the plane's alarm sensors sound for no reason, according to Matthew. In the previous scene, it was obvious that John was running as hard as he could to chase the plane's wheels. After that, Matthew went behind to tell the others. This could be a serious problem because if John had tampered with the hydraulic system below, the plane's wheels would not have come out when the plane was about to land. Even so, Matthew has one plan. He will fly the plane at a higher altitude until it reaches a temperature of -40°C. At that altitude, oxygen will also be depleted, indirectly making John faint from cold and lacking oxygen. After that, Matthew lowers the plane's wheels so that John will fall into the ocean and die. Although it sounds cruel, it's for their safety together, and luckily everyone agrees with him. Soon after, Matthew flew a plane 40,000 feet above sea level. He thought his plan would go well and that John might have frozen in the cold. It was only a matter of time until John fainted and fell, but something unexpected happened. The plane's altitude affects the air pressure, so the cracks in the plane's window panes slowly enlarge, and no one notices. At that time, Terenzio even again caused trouble. He seemed to be blocking Inez, who was about to get drinking water. Not only that, but he also tripped her leg until she fell. Inez, of course, was angry and didn't accept it. She seemed to scold Terenzio and cursed Rick, who was beside Terenzio because Rick was also defending him. At the same time, Laura accidentally saw the crack in the plane's window. She shouted a warning, but it was too late. The window shattered and what happened next was the plane immediately lost its balance. Shortly after, Matthew tried to control it while lowering the plane's altitude. The situation in the passenger cabin seemed very out of control. Inez fell and fainted. Fortunately, Jakub immediately intervened to close the leaking plane window. It also succeeded in making the plane safe and normal again. On the other hand, Matthew had now lowered his plane's altitude. Not long after, Matthew and Terenzio seemed to blame each other. He blamed Terenzio for making a fuss. Meanwhile, Terenzio blamed him for lying about the window. He replied that the window was safe before the evil soldier was in the plane's wheelhouse. Suddenly, Matthew pointed to Rick, who had been assigned to watch the window panes but instead to another chair. While Inez, who had fainted, had regained consciousness, she received help from Laura because when people wore oxygen masks, only Inez did not wear them because she fainted first. At the same time, Zara looks panicked when she finds out that Dominic's oxygen hose is disconnected and seems to be sucked out of the window pane. He looked very difficult to breathe without his oxygen tube. Seeing this, Ayaz did not stay silent and tried to help. But Horst was quite surprised to see Ayaz had a knife, even though airport officials would have checked and made sure the passengers who were going to board the plane were not carrying sharp weapons. Ayaz reasoned that the knife was obtained while in Scotland. He looked skilled and agile and made a new oxygen hose for Dominic then and connected it to Dominic's oxygen device. Finally, Zara looks very relieved but still doesn't thank Ayaz. Shortly after, Matthew announced that their destination to the Hawaiian sanctuary had to be cancelled. This caused the planes to have low altitudes, so they couldn't go fast enough and get to Hawaii before morning. In the end, they were forced to go around the Earth one round first to reach Hawaii without having to experience the time of day. Not long after, the alarm went off again, indicating something was wrong with the plane's hydraulic system. Of course, John was still there, but they couldn't carry out the plan as before due to a leak in the plane window. There was no other way. They had to take out those annoying criminals by force. Soon after, Matthew argues again with Terenzio, who refuses to provide a welding drill, even though the drill is to force open the plane's wheel compartment. He wants Matthew to agree to implement a system of democracy and cooperation between the passengers on the plane. Terenzio said that was an easy condition. Finally, Matthew agreed to Terenzio's request, and they voted first to carry out his plan. After everyone agreed, Terenzio even offered to come with Jakob and Ayaz downstairs to get rid of John. However, there is no access road to the plane's wheelbase, so they have to make their own way by punching holes in the plane's parts using a welding drill. In the cockpit, Sylvie advised Matthew that they should land in Alaska because that was the closest place. Considering that they had to fix the plane window immediately, Matthew agreed. Not long after, Laura came and asked Matthew to fly the plane lower. Previously, she had talked to Zara about Dominic's condition. He has fibrocystic disease, which is a disease that affects the lungs and digestion. He has quite a problem with the plane's current altitude. Laura feels concerned and finally goes to Matthew so Dominic can breathe better. But Matthew refused because it would only further slow the journey. Apart from that, they also had to save fuel because they could not persuade him. Laura then asked Sylvie to leave them. Laura asked Matthew what if his son was in that position. He replied casually that he had no children and his wife married too old. She said the flight attendant named Chloe was pregnant with his child. Laura's words surprised Matthew. She apparently knew that because Gabri had contacted Inez via Instagram. Gabri knows her Instagram because Inez is an influencer. Gabri revealed that Matthew was not a respectable man. Maybe she said that because of revenge on him, who had left her. But Laura knew even though Matthew was not a gentleman, he was still a good person. She again pleads with him to lower the plane's altitude for Dominic's safety. Hearing that, Matthew melts and obeys her request. On the other hand, Jakub and his friends had made an opening to the plane's wheelhouse. But after opening it, they could not see anything in the room because it was very dark. Suddenly, John appeared, trying to grab Terenzio's gun by biting his hand. Luckily, Ayaz managed to take the gun and killed John by shooting him several times. Now the matter was solved, and the three of them went back upstairs to join the others. But Ayaz was confused to see the atmosphere there, which was quite tense. Laura immediately asked him to tell the truth. Soon after, Horst became suspicious after learning that Ayaz had a knife on the plane, and Osman also claimed to see bloodstains on the blanket that wrapped Abdul's body. They all now suspect Ayaz of splitting Abdul's stomach to retrieve the diamond that Abdul swallowed. Osman certainly remembers Abdul at that time saying that he swallowed a diamond. Unexpectedly, Ayaz calmly admitted it, but Ayaz also had reasons. He knew from the start because he paid Abdul to smuggle the diamond. However, Abdul did not know who had ordered him because, later, Ayaz would only meet him after arriving in Russia. Ayaz said that the item was not a diamond but an emerald. This precious stone is a relic of the Sultan from his country and was lost. Ayaz said he intends to return the precious stones to his country, Turkey. He explained that the original plan was not like that. Everything failed when Abdul did the wrong procedure, which resulted in his death, so Ayaz was forced to take the diamond by dissecting his dead stomach. Even though Ayaz has confessed, people still have to decide about his actions, which are still crimes. Moreover, Rick seemed adamant about holding him because Rick really disliked him from the start. After everyone agreed, Ayaz was handcuffed and tied up in the avionics room. Rick looked satisfied and teased him. The scene then changes, showing Ayaz's dark life as the brothel owner in Belgium. He seems to be doing various illegal jobs. Among them are pimps and drug dealers. That night, at his embroidery house, there was a problem when a foreign man injured one of his female employees and had to be rushed to the hospital. Therefore, Ayaz forced the foreign man to give his luxury watch as a ransom or compensation because his female employees could not work for a while due to the behavior of the foreign man. The stranger refused, so he was forced to do it by force. Back to the present, it looks like Matthew and his friend's plane has landed in Alaska. On the plane, there seems to be an argument because Rick is adamant about getting rid of Ayaz and wants to leave him in Alaska. Rick reasons that he doesn't want to endanger everyone and intends to protect them from Ayaz, who he thinks is a criminal. But it seems other passengers are still confused and have not decided. Then Ayaz tried to persuade Rick to listen to his explanation, but he disgustedly closed the avionics room. Rick was angry that everyone was not on his side. Even Terenzio just kept silent. Then he tries to talk to Matthew to get rid of Ayaz, but he answers why he must decide. Matthew reversed Rick and Terenzio's words about democracy, then told them to decide together. On the other hand, Jakub was busy fixing the plane window. Although he managed to repair the glass using artificial glass, he said they still had to replace it with the original glass to make it safer. So the plan is later to land back at the airport in Brussels, Belgium, where they came from, to get the original window glass. A few moments later, outside the plane, Rick seemed to be inciting and provoking people to think that Ayaz was a criminal. Still, Ayaz reasoned that he was just trying to survive by doing various businesses. Everyone seemed annoyed with his attitude, as if he didn't feel guilty. When things got hotter, Terenzio spoke up. He remembered when he was at NATO headquarters, he not only heard about the solar disaster but also heard about a shelter. He didn't know where it was, so he had to return to the NATO headquarters in Belgium to find out the information. Incidentally, their next destination was Belgium. Terenzio said he wanted IS to come to look for information documents on shelters at NATO headquarters. He thought there was no one more competent than IS to help him out of all of them. The ones who were sufficiently skilled and trained were probably just Terenzio and IS. Terenzio said he guaranteed and would be responsible if IS made a problem. Hearing that, some people agreed and raised their hands, but others objected but seemed reluctant to express their opinion. Terenzio did that because he felt he owed IS his life after IS helped him when John almost got him killed. As soon as the others leave, Terenzio removes the handcuffs on IS's hands and says now they are even. After the plane took off, Horst discussed with Matthew and Sylvie. Horst conveyed passengers' complaints about the bland taste of the food. They said all the fruit tasted bland and bad. He suspected that the sun was causing the DNA of the fresh foods to be damaged. That makes sense because fruits come from plants, so the sun doesn't just kill living things like humans and animals but plants. Even so, Horst felt, for now, canned food was still safe. After Horst left, Sylvie tried to talk to Matthew, who didn't seem well. He is now very emotional, and his anger easily explodes because of small things. Like earlier, when Horst explained about food, and it was difficult to understand, it made Matthew emotional. Fortunately, Sylvie could understand that many factors were causing this, such as lack of rest or frustration. But she couldn't help it if Matthew didn't say anything. So she asked Matthew to open up and talk about what was happening. Not long after, Matthew comes clean about Chloe, the female flight attendant he loves, who is pregnant with his child. Moments later, Sylvie came out of the cockpit and talked to Jakub alone. At first, they talked about fresh food they couldn't eat anymore, but finally, they both talked about their favorite food. Afterward, Sylvie told her story after the late Henry. When Henry fell ill, he barely wanted to eat anything. He said all the food tasted bad. Still, uniquely he really likes one food, marinated, halal Mongolian beef, whose character is right under her apartment. She said that Henry liked the food until his life's end, which is why she also missed it so much. Their conversation was suddenly interrupted because there was a shock on the plane. Sylvie immediately went to the cockpit and saw Matthew. He started babbling incoherently, so the shock happened because he wobbled in flying the plane too high. Sylvie was worried and told Matthew to rest, but he refused. Sylvie, who was anxious, told the others about Matthew's condition. Not long after, she returned with Ayaz and Rick. Then they forcefully dragged Matthew out of the cockpit to rest. After being pulled and carried by a crowd, Matthew gave up and went to the toilet to wash his face. As soon as he left, Rick heard a voice from the radio in the avionics room. Some people went to check it out after they heard the talk on the radio in Russian. Jakub, Horst, and Terenzio don't understand Russian, so Horst calls Zara to translate because she is Russian. Zara herself is currently with Ayaz. She is curious and asks about his real purpose for stealing the emeralds from the museum. Her son Dominik admires Ayaz's figure, so she wants to ensure that Ayaz is a good person. According to Zara, even though Ayaz runs criminal businesses, that doesn't mean he is bad-hearted. He always told the truth that his goal was to return the stones to Turkey's original place. Ayaz said he would even send it anonymously, so people wouldn't have to know who had returned the precious stone. He thought by doing that, Ayaz could make his mother proud. Hearing this, Zara seemed to believe it, and soon Horst came asking for help. Long story short, she looks already in the avionics room. She began to listen and tried translating the conversation on the radio. Unfortunately, the sound on the radio wasn't very clear, but Zara managed to catch a few words. Zara concludes that the person speaking on the radio is trapped in outer space. Besides that, the person on the radio said something, namely Stara 17. She said she didn't know what it meant, and they were also surprised and wondered how that person could survive in outer space from the sun's killing rays. After that, they were about to tell Matthew, but they realized that he had not come out of the toilet since that moment. Soon after, Jakub and Laura went to check on him and were very surprised to find Matthew unconscious. She checked Matthew's condition and said he had a high fever and low blood pressure. Laura suspected this was caused by an infection from the wound on his hand, which caused him to have blood poisoning. She seemed to be glaring at Terenzio for causing this, so Laura would temporarily give Matthew antibiotics. To be able to help Matthew, his infected hand must be amputated immediately. Laura couldn't do it on the plane, as there was neither space nor the necessary surgical equipment, so they had to go to the hospital. Aya suggests taking Matthew to the hospital once they arrive in Belgium, but they just realize they must land the plane first to go to Belgium. How does a plane land without the pilot of the plane? Ayaz then thought Sylvie was there and felt she could land the plane. Turning to the cockpit, Sylvie immediately said that she couldn't do it. She might be able to activate autopilot and adjust the plane's path in the air, but landing the plane really required real pilot skill. Jakub asks if Sylvie hasn't seen Matthew do it. She replies that even though someone has seen a sniper shoot, it doesn't make them a sniper right away. However, at this point, they had no other choice. Horst then suggested that Sylvie do it while watching a tutorial on YouTube. Finally, with a heavy heart, she agreed, even though the chances of success were slim. But later, the way to fly the plane was even more complicated. Sylvie said she wouldn't be able to do it without Matthew. Therefore, Matthew's life is in Laura's hands if she succeeds later. She should be able to treat Matthew and leave before sunrise. Moments later, Sylvie is seen starting to land the plane with the help of Jakub, who plays a video tutorial. She seemed to be trying her best not to make a mistake. How many times did she feel unsure, but Jakub kept encouraging her. At first, everything seemed to be going well, but suddenly the plane's engine jammed, causing severe shocks and causing the plane to lose control. Even so, Sylvie still tried her best to control and try to land the plane. Fortunately, Sylvie managed to land her plane safely, albeit not very smoothly. Everyone in the passenger cabin seemed to be cheering and applauding her for successfully landing the plane heroically and saving everyone's lives. Even Terenzio smiled in admiration, and Sylvie looked pleased. Suddenly, he said they were only 2.5 hours in Belgium before sunrise. Thus, Sylvie began to distribute tasks to everyone. Shortly after, Terenzio, Ayaz and Rick will go to NATO headquarters to look for shelter documents. Laura and Horst will take Matthew to the hospital. Zara and Dominic will also come along, as his medicine supply has also run out. Osman and Inez will gather food supplies around the airport, while Jakub and Sylvie will check the plane's engines, finding out what caused the plane's engine to stall. Hearing that, Horst realized that airplane fuel was made from organic material, meaning the fuel they got was also affected by sunlight, just like what happened to fresh food. How do they get the plane back in the air without good fuel? The scene changes and shows Rick's daily life. He lives alone with his mother. When he got home from work, she scolded his mother for watching TV at a volume that was too loud. Understandably, because her mother has problems with hearing. But still, Rick is afraid that the TV sound will disturb the other neighbors. His mother also replied that the hearing aid battery had run out. Then he replaced it with a new one. After that, he went to his room to rest. But Rick turns out to contact a woman named Spida, who has recently been close to him, although they have to keep in touch long distances because she lives in Russia. In the chat, she seemed to keep asking him to send money. Spida wants to buy a plane ticket to Belgium to meet him. Hearing this, Rick said he just went to Russia, even he had already bought his plane ticket this afternoon. He looked impatient to meet Spida, but she was annoyed to hear that, so she immediately hung up. It seems that Spida had no intention of having a serious relationship with Rick from the start and only wanted his money. Unfortunately, he doesn't realize. He still wants to go to Russia to meet her. The scene returns to the present. Rick and Terenzio were seen rummaging through all the passengers' bags and hoping to find something useful. They did that while waiting for Ayaz, who was looking for a car for them to go to NATO headquarters. Not long after, Sylvie came to them. She said that Hawaii was no longer their hope. She had searched the internet for information, and the result was that the place in Hawaii was completely unfinished. So basically, now their only hope is a sanctuary from NATO. She hoped that Terenzio and his friends could get results at NATO headquarters and not go home empty-handed. After leaving Terenzio's place, Sylvie ran into Jakub, who said that Horst's words were true about the plane's damaged fuel. Luckily, the plane's tanks were almost empty, and they could dilute the remnants of the damaged fuel with new fuel. The problem is where they can get fuel that isn't contaminated by sunlight. Osman, who happened to hear the conversation between them, told him that he had worked at a fuel depot with an aircraft fuel storage tank at the bottom of a river. According to him, the fuel can still be used because it is protected by water. Because of that, Osman and Sylvie are now swapping tasks. He will go with Jakub to fetch fuel. Meanwhile, Sylvie will replace Osman's task of finding and gathering food supplies with Inez. Before leaving, Jakub told Inez to keep an eye on Sylvie because he worried about her, whose attitude was slightly different. Meanwhile, after arriving at NATO, Terenzio, Rick, and Ayaz saw the place was empty, and only a few criminals died guarding it, perhaps because no one had informed them of the disaster. The three of them then went to a room used for the previous meeting, where they should be able to get some kind of clue or map of where the shelter was. But there are so many documents that it takes a very long time to go through them one by one. Luckily there, Rick realized that there was a Peabody 1763 CCTV camera. Rick said he previously worked in a museum with the same surveillance system, so he could tell that the 1763 CCTV body could record video and sound. That means the conversations of NATO officials at the meeting have also been recorded. They had to go check it out together in the security room, but Terenzio told Rick to go. However, Terenzio looked a bit dismissive of Rick. After he left, Terenzio said something that offended Ayaz, even though he said he was just joking. Instead of stopping, Terenzio again said something else insulting Ayaz's country. Finally, Ayaz gave a small slap as a warning to him, but he didn't accept it and responded with more force, so they got into a fistfight. At first, the matter might be trivial, but now it turns serious when they fight with the intent to kill each other. Ayaz immediately fell after Terenzio hit him in the face with a flashlight. Terenzio, who realized what he had done, tried to call Ayaz to wake up, but he was already unconscious with his eyes open. while Rick looks very satisfied because he got useful clues after watching CCTV footage. When he sees Terenzio's injured face, he immediately asks Terenzio. Terenzio reasoned that he fell down the stairs because it was dark and said that Ayaz had returned earlier to help the others. Rick seemed to believe it, then explained his discovery that the refuge they were looking for was in Bulgaria. On the radio, they had heard people in outer space say about Stara 17. It turns out that Stara is the name of a district in Bulgaria. As for number 17, Rick doesn't know what it is. He had also recorded the coordinates of the shelter. Just before they left, he returned the CCTV screen to its original state until he saw Ayaz lying helpless. Rick was shocked, but Terenzio immediately turned off his computer and asked Rick to leave. On the other hand, Horst, Laura, Zara, and Dominic have arrived at the hospital to perform surgery on Matthew. His body is heavy enough to make Zara ask Dominic to find her a wheelchair. But as soon as Dominic left, they heard the boy screaming. Zara soon followed, and it turned out that he was screaming after seeing something behind the black plastic curtain. Laura then slowly pulled back the curtain and was surprised to find that many people had died there. Horst guessed that the men were trying to block the sunlight from entering by making shelters. Unfortunately, it didn't work and was in vain. Laura, accompanied by Horst, then left, taking Matthew to the operating room. Meanwhile, Zara goes to get medical supplies for Dominic. Feeling thirsty, Dominic asked his mom for permission to find a drink. Zara then told him not to go too far. Outside, he finds a drink machine, but Dominic was distracted. He saw a bag not far from there. The bag seemed to move like something was trapped in it. He was curious and then opened the bag, and he was surprised when he saw an animal that looked like a mouse out there but was not a mouse. Zara, who heard her son's screams, immediately followed. Moments later, she told Horst and Laura about this. How can there be an animal still alive and not dead after experiencing the time of day? However, Horst doubted it, making Zara annoyed that her son was considered to have lied. Meanwhile, Laura is currently performing surgery on Matthew's infected hand. There, her hands couldn't stop shaking because she was so nervous and afraid. Horst tried to calm and encourage her. Long story short, the operation went smoothly and was successful. But Matthew is still unconscious, and his condition is also not stable. Even so, Zara urges them to leave, even if they must leave him. Laura protests and says if Matthew dies, then they can't fly. Luckily, he woke up not long after so they could leave immediately. Meanwhile, Sylvie and Inez were still looking for food supplies around the airport. They broke into a building and got quite a bit of canned food. Then, by chance, they found a dead lover hugging each other in a room. Seeing that, Inez then asked if Sylvie had someone to die with like that. Sylvie just shook her head. Then Inez told her that she had, but 2 weeks ago, Inez caught her man having an affair with another woman. Now she was grateful that both of them were probably dead. Sylvie suddenly told Inez to go back first. Sylvie said she still had other things to do. However, Inez refused and tried to restrain her, but she left anyway. Inez, annoyed, tried to contact Jakub but did not pick up the call because he was busy moving fuel into the tank truck along with Osman. Besides that, the distance from where they can get airplane fuel and the airport is quite far, about 55 kilometers, due to the different cities. Not long after, Jakub and Osman had returned to the airport, having managed to get plane fuel. Inez immediately approached Jakub and scolded him for not answering her phone calls. She then explained that Sylvie had gone somewhere. Hearing this, Jakub immediately rushed off to look for Sylvie because soon they had to take off. Sylvie turned out to be back in her apartment, crying next to Henry's ash canister. Unexpectedly, Jakub came there and managed to find her. She asked how he could find her apartment. Jakub replied that it was not difficult for him to find Sylvie's apartment, considering that there is only one apartment in Brussels where halal Mongolian beef is underneath. Sylvie had indeed told him about it. There, Jakub could understand what she was feeling, but he hoped Sylvie wouldn't give up just as he didn't give up because she had strengthened him. After chatting for a while with Jakub, she was feeling better now and asked him to leave before it was too late. Meanwhile, Terenzio and Rick had just arrived at the airport. Soon after, Terenzio met with Inez and Osman. Rick informed him of his discovery of a refuge in Bulgaria. Inez and Osman looked relieved, but she asked where Ayaz was. Terenzio even asked back if Ayaz hadn't arrived yet, because he had come back first with supplies. Terenzio also reasoned that his face was injured when he fell down the stairs. A few moments later, he was seen slowly bringing Matthew into the cockpit, and then Sylvie came back and entered the cockpit. Everyone has returned to the plane, but Matthew has not been able to take off the plane because one person has not returned, namely Ayaz. Unfortunately, no one knew that Ayaz might be dead from fighting with Terenzio. In the passenger cabin, Zara, who doesn't see Ayaz's presence, looks panicked and worried. She tries to ask Rick. There, Rick answered he didn't know but with a little nervousness. Afterward, she turned to ask Terenzio, who again did not know the answer. She is suspicious of them. Then she encourages them both until Rick, who can't feel pressured, finally opens his mouth and says Terenzio has done something to Ayaz. Terenzio dodged and immediately scolded Rick, but Zara could conclude that he hurt Ayaz. It seems she already has feelings for Ayaz, so she is angry with Terenzio. Luckily, Laura intervened and told them to fasten their seatbelts because the plane was about to leave. Sadly, Matthew had no choice but to fly the plane because they didn't have much time left until the sun rose. Knowing this, Dominic looked sad because Ayaz did not return, even though the plane had started to move. Unexpectedly from a distance, a car approached. Suddenly someone getting out of the car turned out to be Ayaz. Ayaz was still alive, and he appeared seriously injured. The scene then changes, showing Terenzio being held captive in the avionics chamber. There, he really felt guilty and sorry for Ayaz. Either way, at that time, he had no intention of killing Ayaz, but still, he acted cowardly by lying to people about Ayaz. By now, the passengers had voted and agreed to kick Terenzio off the plane. Meanwhile, Sylvie, Jakub, and Rick seemed to be having a discussion. After a search, the coordinates that Rick got from NATO point to a place that is a dam in Bulgaria's Stara district. It makes sense if the shelter bunker is underwater, considering the water can protect and prevent the sun's rays from killing living things. But the problem is that they don't know the exact location of the bunker. Terenzio, who was eavesdropping on their conversation, suddenly chimed in and said that he had been trained to find traces. But none of the three were interested in receiving help from Terenzio. Moments later, Sylvie is seen announcing to the passengers that they will land at the Bulgarian airbase about 15 km from the Stara Dam. When they got there, they only had 40 minutes before sunrise. She said that, hopefully, there would be a vehicle they could use at the airbase. Otherwise, they would have to run to where the dam was. After hearing this, the passengers started to protest because there was no way they could run 15 kilometers in only 40 minutes. Sylvie immediately stopped their protest and said that all they needed to do now was try their best. She said they wouldn't have any fuel left to fly again if they failed. If they want to look for fuel there, they also don't have time, so she asks that they all get ready because there is only one chance for them. After hearing Sylvie's explanation, Zara is seen approaching Ayaz. She says she has sold one kidney for Dominic's surgery in Russia. She also tells Ayaz that in her current state, she can't run far in such a short time. Zara said if she cannot catch up later, she wants Ayaz to promise to take Dominic to the bunker and take care of her son. Ayaz looks at her closely and holds her hand, and promises her. Not long after, Rick came over and said he wanted to discuss something with Ayaz. Rick then invited Ayaz to talk privately. There, Rick revealed that if he should have been detained with Terenzio, he admitted that he had seen Ayaz on the computer screen. Rick apologizes for leaving him because he thought Ayaz was dead. He ordered Ayaz to punish or hurt him as proof of remorse. Hearing that, Ayaz refused to reply to Rick and forgave him. Ayaz appreciates his courage to admit his mistakes because not everyone can be like that. Then he asked Rick to forget what had happened. Finally, they reconciled. Afterward, Rick looked very relieved. Then he admitted lying when he said he went to Russia to attend currency security. Actually, he went to Russia to meet a woman who he knew from the internet. He showed the photo to Ayaz, and Ayaz smiled at his explanation. Not long after, Inez came and saw the photo. She immediately commented that she had met the model in the photo several times. Hearing that fact, Rick smiled shyly, immediately folded the photo, and threw it in the trash bag. On the other hand, Sylvie was seen talking to Matthew, who praised Sylvie for being so tough and reliable. He wondered how the Air Force could fire Sylvie as a helicopter pilot. She confesses that she wasn't fired but resigned the day after Henry died. She still feels guilty because when Henry experiences symptoms of cancer, she tells Henry not to worry and instead makes fun of him for being old. So he took her advice and ignored the symptoms for a long time. Because of that, Sylvie was very sad. Matthew convinced her to forgive herself. After the conversation ended, Sylvie got out of the cockpit and called Ayaz, Rick, and Jakub to discuss Terenzio's fate. Jakub then revealed that if the decision was his, he would leave Terenzio to die. But now it depended on Ayaz because he was the one Terenzio was trying to kill. Ayaz seemed to think for a moment. He didn't know what to do, but if today was the last day of his life, he didn't want it if his last act was to sentence someone to death. They seemed to accept the decision, but Rick advised them not to open the handcuffs. Long story short, Matthew and his friend's plane arrived at the Bulgarian airbase. People immediately rushed out of the plane, and Sylvie immediately looked for a vehicle they could use. Luckily, they both found 2 cars that could be used, and the gas is also full tank. There, Terenzio thanked Rick, thinking Rick had decided not to leave him. Rick then replied to thank him back because it was him who helped Terenzio. Hearing this, Terenzio was lost in thought, and not long after, Ayaz and Sylvie came with their car. Everyone then split into 2 groups. Rick, Matthew, Osman, Laura, and Terenzio went with Sylvie. Meanwhile, Jakub, Horst, Inez, Zara, and Dominic went with Ayaz. Afterward, the 2 cars drove away with Sylvie's group car in front and Rick as a guide. After driving for quite a while, Matthew, who noticed Ayaz's group trailing behind, asked Sylvie to slow down the car. But she replied that Ayaz already knew the way because he, earlier on the plane, had seen a map of the route. Shortly after that, in front of them, there was a fork. Rick said to take the right path. On the other hand, it turns out that Ayaz's group is quite far behind. At first, everything was going pretty well until suddenly Ayaz mumbled incoherently like a dazed person. Everyone panicked. They repeatedly tried to resuscitate him. Ayaz remained motionless, causing the car to start to sway and hit the shoulder of the road. Fortunately, there were no fatalities in the accident. They only suffered minor injuries. Then Horst and the others immediately left the car and saw Ayaz still silent. Not long after, Ayaz came back to his senses and apologized. He did not know why he had experienced this, and it turned out that he had experienced it several times. Horst said they must continue their journey by running now that their car can no longer be used because of the limited time. Suddenly, Inez protested, but there was no time to argue or find other ways. Meanwhile, Sylvie's group had arrived at the entrance to the dam, but the gate closed automatically as their car passed. They immediately got off. Osman was there running, trying to hold the gate open, but it turned out that the gate was electrified. He immediately fell unconscious. There, Matthew found the button controlling the gate, but the problem was that the button had to be pressed to open it. If not pressed, it will close. They didn't know how to keep the gate open permanently because only 16 minutes left until the sun rose. Unexpectedly, Terenzio offered to press the button until Ayaz's group arrived. He said they were not too far behind and would arrive in a few minutes. After that, he will later follow by climbing into Ayaz's car. Matthew said Terenzio didn't need to do that. Then Terenzio replied to go first, and he's here because he wants to make amends. Hearing that, Matthew and the others finally agreed, but Sylvie couldn't believe it. She told the others to carry the unconscious Osman to the car while she undid Terenzio's handcuffs. When everyone left, instead of opening the handcuffs, Sylvie tied the handcuffs to the control switch post and threw the key not far away. Seeing that, Terenzio was angry and disapproved, but Sylvie said that once Ayaz's group arrived, he could open the handcuffs. Sylvie did that to ensure Terenzio didn't go anywhere because she knew he would only think about his safety. Ayaz's group is currently trying to run toward the dam. Dominic is seen being carried by Ayaz, then Zara, beside him, asks if he has had a long illness that made him silent and dazed. Ayaz answered, actually recently, after his fight with Terenzio. Hearing this, Zara looked even more furious at Terenzio. Not long after, they came to a fork in the road, but it seemed that Ayaz had forgotten his way, and he wasn't sure which way to take either. After thinking for a moment, Ayaz said to take the left path when it should be the right. After they ran far enough, Ayaz and his friends found a dead end that was closed by a gate that was locked with a chain of padlocks. They realized they had taken the wrong path but needed more time to go back and make a detour. Horst, Ayaz, and everyone looked confused. They also can't just climb over the fence because it is already electrified. After thinking for a while, Horst said this is simple science. They can climb over the fence safely if their shoes do not conduct electricity and do not touch the wires from both poles together. Soon after, they used a nearby truck tire as a foothold and removed their clothes to cover the top of the spiked fence. Back to Sylvie's group. She stopped the car when she saw several cars from the airport parking on the side of the road. Most likely, that's where the bunker entrance is located. Rick noticed a ventilation tower around there. Their guess was right. After descending the stairs, they managed to find an entrance, but the door was locked. Fortunately, Rick, experienced in security, could break the door lock with a stone. After making sure all his friends were in, Sylvie said she would pick up the others. Matthew warned her, remembering that there were only 3 minutes left. Even so, Sylvie still left, and shortly after she climbed back onto the road, she saw that Ayaz's group had already arrived. Then Sylvie led them into the bunker to catch up with Matthew and the others who had already left. After going deeper and down the stairs, 3 criminals appeared from behind the door and intercepted them. Colonel Lam, the leader of the army group there, asked where the Italian soldier with them was, and the person he talks about is Terenzio. Unfortunately, Sylvie realized that Terenzio was tied to the control button post. As if doing the same thing with Terenzio, she pretended not to know while asking if he wasn't there yet. The series closed by showing Terenzio, who began to give up and surrender when the sun slowly began to rise. This series is so interesting. Many characters have their own traits, problems, and lives but contradict each other, which causes conflicts between them. The moral message of this film is to dare to tell the truth even in any circumstances.